Every long-haul driver on the I-70 corridor knows about mile 87, even if half of them won't admit it out loud in front of anyone who isn't already a trucker themselves. Truckers call it Dead Man's Curve, a sharp bend cutting through a stretch of dark highway where, according to the guys who've been driving longer than I have, something takes a truck almost every year and never leaves behind an explanation that makes sense on paper. I've been driving for about 6 years when I first heard about it. Sitting in a diner off exit 74, listening to a couple of older drivers trade stories the way truckers do at 2 a.m. over bad coffee. One of them, a guy named Dutch, who'd been hauling freight since before I was born, told me flat out that if I ever found myself coming up on mile 87 after midnight, I should slow down, keep both hands steady, and whatever I did, not answer anything that came through my radio out there. I laughed it off at the time. Truckers love a good ghost story, especially the ones who've spent enough nights alone on empty highways to need something to talk about, besides mile markers and way station hours. I'd heard a dozen variations of highway legends over the years by that point. Haunted rest stops, phantom hitchhikers. The usual collection of stories that circulate through any profession involving long hours and longer stretches of solitude. Dutch's story didn't feel any different from the rest of them at the time. I didn't think about that conversation again for almost 2 years, until a rerouted delivery put me on that exact stretch of road for the first time. Running late at night, with a tight delivery window, and no real choice but to take it. The drive started ordinary enough. Empty highway, low traffic, the usual hum of tires and engine that makes long hauls feel almost meditative after enough years behind the wheel. My CB radio was on low, mostly static, and the occasional distant trucker chatting about weather or road conditions somewhere miles ahead of me. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering, right up until I hit the sign marking mile 85. I remember glancing at that sign and feeling a small, almost involuntary flicker of tension. Dutch's warning surfacing in my memory for the first time in nearly 2 years. Unwelcome and oddly specific, given how little I'd thought about it since that night in the diner. That's when the static on my radio changed. It didn't get louder exactly, just different. A kind of texture underneath the normal hiss that made my attention snap toward the dashboard without me consciously deciding to look. I told myself it was probably just interference from the terrain. Hills and dense tree line out there known to mess with signal in ways flat highway usually doesn't. Then a voice came through, rough and strained, cutting through the static in short bursts. Breaks out. Breaks out! I reached for the CB mic on instinct, the way you do when you hear another driver in trouble. Ready to ask for his location, his mile marker, anything I could relay to dispatch or emergency services. Before I could key the mic, the voice repeated itself again. The exact same words, same strained tone, same rough edge, like a recording looping rather than a person actually speaking to me in real time. Breaks out. Breaks out. I checked my channel. I was on the standard trucker channel everyone in that region uses, and I could hear plenty of other chatter on it clearly. Normal conversations about way stations and weather. None of it referencing any trouble on the road. None of it acknowledging the voice I was hearing at all. I tried hailing whoever it was directly, asking for a location, a truck number, anything. Some detail I could pass along if this turned out to be a real emergency. No response. Just that same looping phrase, fainter now, fading the way a signal does when a truck moves out of range. Except I hadn't moved, and the voice had started clear and strong, not distant at all. I told myself it was some kind of ghost transmission, an old recording somehow bouncing around the terrain, a phenomenon truckers occasionally talk about on remote stretches with the right kind of atmospheric conditions. I've heard stranger explanations for stranger things out on the road, transmissions from decades past supposedly trapped in certain valleys. Radio waves bending around hills in ways that pick up broadcasts from towers that stopped operating years ago. It's the kind of explanation that sounds almost reasonable at 1 a.m. alone on a dark highway. Reasonable enough that I chose to believe it over the alternative. I kept driving, watching my mile markers climb toward 87, Telling myself Dutch's warning was exactly the kind of story that gets told so many times, it starts believing itself. The road started curving as I approached the marker, the highway bending sharper than most stretches out there. Dense tree line pressing close on both sides. No shoulder lighting, nothing but my own headlights cutting through the dark. My hands tightened on the wheel without my permission, some old instinct kicking in that had nothing to do with logic. And then my own brakes, the actual physical brakes on my own truck, started feeling heavy. Not failing exactly. Not the way a real brake failure feels, but resistant. Like something was pulling against the pedal from somewhere I couldn't see or explain. A weight that shouldn't have been there on a truck I'd inspected myself before this exact run. I eased off the accelerator, downshifting, trying to keep the truck steady through the curve despite the strange resistance building under my foot. That's when my headlights caught something standing dead center in my lane, right at the apex of the curve. A figure, tall, still, facing directly into my headlights without shielding its eyes, without moving at all, standing exactly where any driver taking that curve at speed would have no room left to avoid it. I don't remember deciding to swerve. I just remember doing it, wrenching the wheel hard, the trailer fighting against the sudden movement, tires screaming against asphalt as 40,000 pounds of truck and cargo fought the laws of physics through a curve that already had a reputation for punishing exactly this kind of mistake. For a few seconds that felt considerably longer, I genuinely believed I was about to become the next story other drivers would tell each other at 2 a.m. in some diner, off some exit, a cautionary tale with my name attached to it. The kind of thing Dutch himself might one day mention to some other rookie driver without ever knowing the full details of how it actually happened. The truck held, barely, but it held, tires finally catching solid pavement again as I came out the far side of the curve, trailer swaying hard enough that I felt it in my spine before it finally settled. My whole body was shaking by the time I got the rig stable again. Adrenaline flooding through me in a way I hadn't experienced behind the wheel in years. Not since a genuine near miss with black ice early in my career. I pulled onto the shoulder the second I found a safe stretch to do it. Hazards on, hands still locked around the wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. I sat there for a long moment before I made myself look back at the curve through my mirrors, half expecting to see the aftermath of whatever I'd nearly hit. Debris, a body, anything that would explain what my headlights had shown me. The road behind me was completely empty. No figure, no skid marks besides my own. Nothing at all standing in that curve except the dark tree line and the faint glow of my own hazard lights reflecting off wet asphalt. Sat on that shoulder for almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to keep driving, running my hands over the brake pedal repeatedly, half convinced I'd imagined the resistance entirely, half terrified I hadn't. When I finally got moving again, my CB radio had gone completely silent. Not even the usual background static I'd grown so used to over the years. Just dead air the rest of the way to my delivery. I mentioned what happened to Dutch a few weeks later, back at that same diner off exit 74, half expecting him to laugh at me the way I'd laughed at him. He didn't. He just nodded slowly, told me I was lucky, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the official state highway record for that stretch lists 3 separate fatal accidents at that exact curve over the past decade. Each one filed under the same cause, brake failure, despite post-accident inspections finding the brakes in question completely intact. He said the first driver on record, years before I ever started hauling freight, had radio dispatch right before losing control, using almost the exact same 2 words I'd heard looping through my own CB that night, and that particular detail had apparently never made it into any official report, just passed along quietly between drivers who'd heard the story enough times to trust where it came from. I still drive that route sometimes when dispatch has no other choice. I always slow down well before mile 85 now, and I keep my CB radio off entirely until I've cleared mile 90, no matter how quiet the rest of the drive gets without it. Other drivers ask me sometimes why I take that particular precaution on that specific stretch. And I usually just tell them I had a close call with the terrain once. Which is true enough without inviting the follow-up questions I'm not sure I have good answers for anyway. Company policy says never pick up hitchhikers. Insurance liability, mostly, plus the usual safety concerns that come with letting a stranger into a cab you're alone in for hours at a time. Every driver hears that rule during orientation and mostly follows it without much thought. The same way you follow any workplace policy that sounds reasonable enough not to question. I broke that rule exactly once, on a stretch of Route 9 outside a town so small it barely registers on most maps. And I've never broken it again since. I'd been driving long haul for almost 4 years by that point, mostly regional runs through the Midwest. The kind of routes where you learn every diner, every rest stop, every stretch of highway that feels a little too empty even by trucking standards. Route 9 was one of those stretches, a 2-lane road cutting through miles of farmland and forest with almost nothing in between. The kind of place where cell service drops out for 20-30 miles at a stretch. I'd run that particular route maybe a dozen times before that night without incident. Just another quiet regional haul that paid decently and never gave me much reason to think twice about it. It was close to midnight when I saw him, standing on the shoulder with a duffel bag at his feet, thumb out in the universal signal every driver recognizes instantly. I remember thinking it was strange. A hitchhiker way out there with nothing around for miles, no town, no gas station, nothing that would explain how he'd ended up standing on that particular stretch of empty road. Against every rule I'd ever been trained on, I slowed down and pulled over. He was polite when he climbed in, thanked me quietly, said he just needed a ride to the next town over, maybe 40 minutes up the road. I didn't get a great look at him in the dark cab, just an impression of someone probably in their 30s, wearing a jacket a little too heavy for the mild weather that night. I asked him the usual small talk questions truckers ask, where he was headed, what happened to his car, that kind of thing. He answered in short, quiet sentences, never quite elaborating, never quite making it awkward enough that I wanted to press further. Something about his voice struck me as slightly off in a way I couldn't quite place at the time. Flat in a way that didn't match the mild, apologetic way he thanked me for stopping. After that initial exchange, he went quiet and I let him, figuring he was tired or just not much of a talker. I kept driving, radio playing low, headlights carving through the dark ahead of us. The two of us sitting in a silence that felt ordinary enough at the time. I remember being grateful for the quiet company more than anything. The kind of low-key comfort of not being completely alone on a long, dark stretch of road, even if the person sitting beside me wasn't especially chatty. Long-haul driving alone for years teaches you to appreciate even the smallest, most unremarkable company. Maybe 15 minutes into the drive, I glanced over out of habit, the way you do when someone's sitting in your passenger seat, just to check he was still comfortable, still awake. He was sitting perfectly still, facing forward, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead through the windshield with an expression I couldn't quite read in the dim dashboard light. I didn't think much of it at the time. Plenty of people just sit quietly on long rides. Another 10 minutes passed. I reached over to adjust the cab's interior light. Just a small dome light I sometimes flip on briefly to check my mirrors more clearly on darker stretches. And in that brief flash of light, I got my first real look at him. The passenger seat was empty. I nearly swerved off the road right then, my whole body flooding with the kind of sudden, sharp fear that overrides thought entirely for a second or two. I flipped the dome light off and back on immediately, some part of my brain still trying to explain it away as a trick of shadow, a flicker of light catching the seat wrong. He was there again. Same position, same quiet stillness, staring forward like nothing had happened. I kept my eyes on the road after that, hands locked on the wheel, heart hammering hard enough that I could hear it over the engine noise. I told myself I'd imagine the empty seat, that exhaustion plays tricks on drivers late at night, that I'd been driving 12 hours straight and my eyes had simply glitched for half a second in a way that meant nothing at all. I ran through every rational explanation I could think of. A shadow catching wrong, a reflection off the window, my own tired brain filling in details that weren't actually there. None of it felt entirely convincing, but it was enough to keep my hands steady on the wheel and my foot steady on the gas. I didn't dare check again for a while after that. About 5 minutes later, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, close enough that it seemed to be coming from directly behind my seat, rather than from the passenger side at all, even though there was nothing behind me but the sleeper cab, and I was completely certain no one had climbed back there. I remember trying to convince myself it was the road noise. Tires on uneven asphalt producing some kind of rhythmic sound. My exhausted brain had decided to interpret as breathing. Though even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't quite right. That road noise doesn't pause and resume the way actual breathing does. I told the hitchhiker, my voice tighter than I wanted it to sound, that we were getting close to the town he'd asked for. He didn't respond. I glanced over again, forcing myself to, and found him still sitting exactly as he had been, unmoving, silent, staring forward. The breathing continued, closer now, close enough that I felt something, like warm air against the back of my neck despite the cab's air conditioning, running steadily the whole time. I hit the gas harder than I probably should have on that stretch of road, desperate to reach the town, desperate to have some kind of witness, some kind of light, anything besides the empty dark highway and whatever was breathing directly behind me. The hitchhiker in the passenger seat still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since our brief exchange at the start of the ride, and something about his stillness had started feeling less like quiet and more like something being deliberately, carefully controlled. I remember thinking with a kind of detached clarity that surprised me even in the moment, that whatever was breathing behind me and whatever was sitting so perfectly still beside me might not have anything to do with each other at all. That I might have picked up two separate problems on that dark stretch of road instead of just one. The lights of the town finally appeared ahead, gas station signs and a scattering of streetlights breaking up the dark. I pulled into the first lit parking lot I found, an all-night gas station, and threw the truck into park harder than necessary, hands trembling badly enough that it took me 2 tries to get the gear lever fully seated. I turned to tell him we'd arrived, already reaching to unlock the door for him, despite the strange tension still sitting heavy in my chest. The passenger seat was empty. Not flickering light empty this time. Just empty. Seatbelt still buckled across nothing at all. Duffel bag gone from the floor, where I distinctly remembered him setting it when he climbed in. I sat there in that gas station parking lot with the engine running for almost 10 minutes. Refusing to check the sleeper cab behind me, refusing to check anything at all, until another driver pulled in beside me and the ordinary sight of another human being finally convinced me to move. I remember watching him climb out of his own cab, stretch head toward the store for coffee, completely unaware of anything unusual, and something about that mundane normalcy helped steady me enough to finally act. I checked the sleeper cab eventually, hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain separating it from the front of the cab. Empty. Exactly as it should have been. Nothing out of place. No sign anyone had ever been back there at all. I checked twice more after that, running my hand along the bunk. The small storage compartments, anywhere a person could conceivably have been hiding and found nothing every time, which somehow left me feeling worse rather than better. I never picked up another hitchhiker after that night, no matter how empty the road looked or how convincing the reason seemed. I mentioned it once to another driver at a truck stop months later, half expecting to be laughed at, and instead watched his face go carefully blank in a way that told me he'd heard some version of this story before, on that same stretch of Route 9, from someone else entirely. He asked me quietly what the hitchhiker had looked like, and when I described him, the heavy jacket, the flat, quiet voice. The way he'd sat so perfectly still, the other driver just nodded slowly and changed the subject. The way people do when they've decided a conversation has gone somewhere they'd rather not follow any further. He didn't offer any details, and I didn't ask for any. Some stretches of highway, I've learned, are better left driven straight through without stopping, and without looking too closely at whoever happens to be standing on the shoulder waiting for a ride, no matter how ordinary they seem at first glance.